Please welcome Catherine Ull to the stream with their talk, Dumpster Fires, 6 Things I Learned About IR by Being a Firefighter.
Hello, everybody, and a big thank you to CircleCityCon for having me here today. As the introduction stated, I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that I learned about being a firefighter. I've been a volunteer firefighter for a number of years now, and thankfully, I've learned things from that, I guess you'd call it hobby, that I've brought into my day job. So let's see what we're going to talk about today. So here's our agenda. I'll do a little intro, a little about me. We'll talk about what IR really is, some firefighting stuff, some differences and similarities between the two, some challenges and opportunities that I've learned. I'll give you a short summary and some final thoughts. All right. So this is a little about me. If any of you have met me or heard me speak in the past, most of you know I'm on staff and involved with a number of different cons. I volunteer all over the place. I'm actually volunteering with CircleCityCon today as well. I've spoken at some places and I've got some certs and some degrees and things. This is the slide most of you probably don't know about me if you had met me in the past. I am technically a state certified fire instructor, and I have a bunch of credits toward a community college degree. I was a certified fire investigator at both levels in the state of New York. And I also have my certification as a fire instructor. And I was a member of J-Fire. So I've been in the firefighting community. It's been about 24 years that I've been doing this. And as if those of you who happen to hear Alyssa's talk this morning about making parallels between one thing that you're passionate about and taking them to another thing you're passionate about, I think that finding those parallels can be very instructive. So for anyone who doesn't necessarily believe, she's not really a firefighter, okay, well, here I am. I am right in the middle there. I'm holding what's called a thermal camera, which is a camera that allows us to see different gradations of temperature. So things that are very hot will show up as more of a white color, and things that are cooler will show up as varying shades of gray, darker as it's cooler. So it's really just showing that differentiation. Okay, so now let's get into some of the meat and potatoes. What exactly is incident response? Because not everybody knows. So this is what I'm going to use as a basic definition of incident response. It's these technical components that we need to analyze and contain an incident, ideally from going further. And what does that entail? Well, it means we're going to address network events. We can proactively or reactively respond to them. And it's any event that can affect the CIA triangle, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that information. Now, I want to just quickly note this differs slightly from incident handling, and we'll talk about that in a minute. These are the goals of incident response, right? We want to make sure we know when something has occurred. If there's an attacker involved, we want to stop them. We want to minimize any damage that they might have caused. And we're going to follow through to find out, like, what happened so that we can prevent it from happening in the future. These are your basic phases of incident response. You can see we have, preparation. We're going to identify things, contain them, get rid of the bad guys, recover, and we're going to hopefully learn some lessons from that experience, which will lead to better preparation. This just breaks down all of those stages and the kinds of things we do at each one, right? So during that preparation stage, we're going to document the heck out of everything, because if you don't know what you have or where it is, it's very difficult to respond when there's a problem. We might build some tools. We might not only build tools, but we might take some tools that we just bought and put them in place, or we might be researching and deciding on some tools. We're going to be aware of the attacks. We're going to find some mechanism to tell us whether it's an external entity or we have systems in place that are telling us there's a problem. The way we'll contain, obviously, is we'll say patch things, we'll block C2 traffic, we'll pull a power cord if it's necessary. And to get rid of the attacker, we're going to do some form of remediation, maybe take a compromised host off the network. And recovering is all about restoring those business functions. So obviously, if you are in a situation where you have a department go down or a process that is affected, we need to make sure those things are back online. Then we want to take what we've learned from all of this so that we don't make that same mistake a second time. Here's the reason why I separated incident response from incident handling. Now, in small organizations, it's impossible to separate these because there just isn't the manpower. But ideally, if you have a large enough organization, you really want somebody else doing the incident handling. This is the logistics and communications, coordinating, planning, all the things that go into resolving an incident. If you're the person who's doing incident response, you're typically boots on the ground working on that response. You don't also want to be reporting to somebody right in front of you who keeps asking you, when are you going to be done? When are you going to be done? What's going on? And so ideally, you want someone else handling that side of it. And we'll see how that parallels some of the things that I've learned as a firefighter in just a minute. So, as parallels go, let's now talk about what firefighting is, which may seem somewhat obvious, right? It's the attempt to prevent the spread of additional fire. We want to extinguish an unwanted fire, and I specify unwanted because some of us might have a barbecue pit, right? And we want that fire. We want to cook our food over it, but we don't necessarily want our house on fire. We don't want our garage on fire. Our vehicle on fire, or just, a fire in the woods behind us that's out of control. So, for what it's worth, that's how I'm defining it. So what are our goals as firefighters? Well, our number one goal is to protect the health and safety of ourselves and others. So others including the public and including our other members of our firefighting team. We want to protect everybody and their property, private property, public property. We want to make sure to protect the environment. When you put water on a fire, if you put it on the kind of fire it shouldn't be on, because there are fires we don't put out with water, we could actually cause a bigger problem than we mean to by allowing chemicals that are runoff to get into streams. We want to also minimize disruption of the community, right? So if there's a major fire, you've probably had to be rerouted, whether it's maybe down a different street, maybe you've had to get off a highway somewhere because there's been a car fire or something. So we want to minimize those things. So we also have a similar cycle that is called the preparedness cycle. And this really comes from the more general idea of incident response for firefighters, which we'll just see in a moment. But you'll see it's very similar, right? We've got preparation, we have something that happens in emergency, we have a response, we recover, we consider mitigation, and we're right back to preparation again. So what do we mean in terms of firefighting in these particular things? Well, mitigation, as you'll see, is about preventing future emergencies or minimizing their effects. So you'll often see firefighters who are doing educational different kinds of events. So maybe an open house, maybe they go to schools, they hand out smoke detectors, we make sure sprinklers are in place. And our preparedness are things like we maintain our gear. We're going to prepare to handle that emergency. We do what's called pre-planning for buildings. So we're going to take a look and we're going to see in terms of those buildings, are there problems with that building that if there was a fire, it would be difficult to access? Maybe it's wires that are in front of it. Maybe it's the fact that the street's really narrow. Maybe the houses are very close together. In terms of response, that's the actual responding to the emergency. Our goal there, of course, is to save property and lives, including our own. And then the recovery. So we're going to clean up. We're going to, make sure that we at least clean up as much as we can. And then it could be other entities come in to help with restoration and doing repairs. So this is another slide from the same fire that we saw in the very beginning. And I'm going to tell you a little story, and then later I'll tell you how it ends. So here, I'm just doing my job. In the picture on the left, I'm the person behind, there's a gentleman sort of leaning over, and what I am doing is I am changing his air bottle. Air bottles are what firefighters use to go into those smoky environments so that we don't breathe in those toxic chemicals. But they're only good for a certain period of time. Most bottles these days are like roughly 30 minutes, some are 45, and that's what they're rated for, but most people wind up using them a lot faster. When a firefighter starts to run out of air, they come out, and somebody who is in charge of changing the bottle takes the bottle out of the harness. You can see a little bit of the harness on the picture on the right, and replaces it with a fresh bottle. So this was my job at that fire at that moment. I was replacing bottles for interior firefighters who were coming in and needed fresh oxygen. So as you can see on the left, that's what I'm doing. I want you to pay special attention to the picture on the right. I want you to notice the blackening in the shoulder of the firefighter. And I want you to notice closely how deep it is and how far back it goes. And unfortunately, what happened as I was changing his bottle is something that I won't forget. And it's something that actually was the impetus for this talk. So we'll come back to that. All right, so in firefighting, we have something called the incident command system. For those of you in the military, this should be fairly similar to things that you've experienced because this is our chain of command. And we like to refer to this as the organized response to a problem. It's how we organize who does what at a scene. And this is really helpful. And I think we could find some use for this in our incident response system in computing. This is what it looks like. You'll notice that for every particular individual involved, there are not a ton of people underneath. And that's part of what makes this really, really effective. The incident commander only has a couple of people under them. And the thing that they're going to focus on is the big picture. And these other folks are going to take pieces of that big picture, and it's going to be their responsibility. So, for example, at a fire, the section that we focus on the most is probably going to be operations. Operations are much like our incident responders, who are boots on the ground, and they're directing exactly what needs to happen as guided by the incident commander. So what does that look like more in detail? So this is breaking that down. Your IC, your incident commander, is going to define the overall goal and operational objectives. And it might be overall for an entire fire. It might be for a subsection of a fire, depending on what the focus is for the IC at the moment. But then operations is going to take that information and determine the actual strategy and tactics that go into exactly what the teams are going to do. So who's going to go in, and are they going to knock down a wall? Is somebody going to take out a window? How is ventilation going to happen? Those kinds of things. There are also people in very large incidents, especially, that handle specifically logistics. Do we need more people? Are there special supplies and equipment that need to be brought in for that particular incident? Then there's somebody who handles planning. What if this is a big, big incident? So the ICS system was used for things like Hurricane Katrina. So long range planning and the ultimate demobilization of that planning, someone's got to do that too. So, and then in terms of money, money's got to come from somewhere. So again, especially when it's a larger incident, you might need money to buy things. So they take care of compliance and licenses and all those little administrative details, which can be significant. All right, so let's do some comparing. So in terms of methodology, you'll see that these, while they're in a slightly different order, there's preparation involved in both. You have some form of response and mitigation, whether we call it mitigation or containment. We're going to be doing some form of recovery. And I added lesson learned to firefighting, even though it's not officially in that circle, because realistically, we do come back to the firehouse, and we typically do spend a bunch of time as soon as we kind of get back and clean up, and maybe not the same day, maybe it's the next day. We talk about what happened and how we could do it better next time, and what went wrong and what went right. So we're doing lessons learned, even if it's not part of that formal cycle. Here's some things that I think are interesting misconceptions about both. So for incident response, not every event is an incident, but a lot of people think that's the case. We get lots and lots of events, right? Things that could potentially have an impact on our CIA triangle, but don't necessarily. And we don't really handle an incident the same way every time. I mean, some kinds we do, right? There are certain things that are the same every time. And there are lots of times where you see something you've never seen before. And so then you have to figure out what you're going to do with it. We know, those of us who've been doing this a while, it is not the case that every incident gets solved quickly, right? There are some you can just, quickly shut right down. And then there are others, it could take weeks or months. The thing that I want to bring out here is this next point. There is the thought that everybody on an IR team needs to be a rock star. And I'll tell you what, it's not true. We need lots of different people who are good at lots of different things for incident response. And some people are really good at some things, and some people are really good at other things. And we need to be cognizant of our strengths among those people so that we can best utilize those resources. We also can't always attribute what happened accurately. It's really sometimes very difficult. I was talking about this with somebody earlier today in a chat that, attribution's tough. And yes, there are times when we can figure out exactly, who the bad actor was and exactly how they get in, but not always. And there's some parallel misconceptions to firefighting. Did you know that firefighters are not always paid? As a volunteer firefighter, I don't make a dime, and neither does anybody else in my entire department. We have 4 fire companies that each have 20 to 35, 40 members. So we're talking over 100 people who don't get paid a dime for saving your life. That's it. That's it. We do it because we enjoy it. It's something that we have really taken on as part of who we are. Now, what does that sound like in incident response? Anybody out there ever feel that way about security? I mean, I don't know. That's sort of how I feel, right? It's just part of who I am. Obviously, firefighters. Yeah, not always big, tough dudes. Not a big, tough dude right here. We also don't fight every fire the same way. In the same way that we don't do that with incident response, yes, we have certain things that we pay attention to and certain methodologies that we follow, but we're going to let the facts and the details of a scene dictate how we're going to fight that fire, and we're going to let that incident command structure help clarify those particular details. We definitely don't extinguish every fire quickly. In fact, the fire that I showed you the picture of earlier on, we were there about 4 hours. It was a long fire and it was a mess. And it's also not a full-time job. Again, it's something I do as a volunteer and I put a lot of hours in, but my day job is doing incident response and security. So here are some really important distinctions between the two. IR doesn't usually involve life safety. Now, that's not true in healthcare, right? So for those of you working in hospitals or clinics, or you have anything to do with life safety, you can truly say if something goes wrong, this is a life threat. But at the university where I work, I'm frequently telling people no one will die because the network is unavailable because something went wrong, right? So you have to think in terms of risk. How serious a risk is this? IR teams typically are paid. Most fire departments that aren't in major cities in New York State are not paid. And that's true in other places around the country. Certainly firefighters have gear and we use all kinds of equipment like that camera I showed you earlier. And IR teams are going to be using the computers and software, not so much hoses. We as a firefighter, we wear our special gear. As an IR person, I'm wearing what's comfortable, especially if it's going to be something where I'm working for hours. We sometimes show up in special vehicles as firefighters, right? Big fire trucks, ambulances, things that make a lot of noise. And of course, as a firefighter, we're going to use water, foam, and chemicals and things to take down fires. We aren't going to do the same kind of firefighting. We're not going to pull a plug in quite the same way. Although I've certainly been on situations that were electrical fires where part of taking that fire out was literally pulling the plug. Here are some similarities I think that are worth noting. And this is really what's going to lead into some of these things that I learned, right? In both cases, we need to focus on that immediate issue first and figure the cause out later. As someone who's been doing both firefighting and fire investigation for a long time, I don't do anything with fire investigation directly until the fire is out. And even when it's out, yes, I'm making mental notes of what I'm seeing, but I may not be changing anything or doing anything further. That's really the same in incident response, right? In some cases, we don't pull the plug because we need to see what the attacker is doing. We're going to use triage. And for those of you not familiar with the term triage, it's just this idea where you have a lot of things coming at you in an incident. In a fire scene or an accident, this is probably the easiest way to understand it. Let's say there's a motor vehicle accident, which is one of the things firefighters are often assisting with, and you have multiple victims. If there's only, say, 1 or 2 of you and there's 5 victims, not everybody can get help right away. Who do you help first? So triage involves this idea of considering the risk for each one of those patients. If you have a patient who literally just appears to be decapitated, something like really significant like that, you can't save that person. They're gone. And you might have somebody who's screaming in pain, but they're seemingly reasonably functional. You might not want to focus on them and instead focus on somebody who has a significant leg wound that over a short period of time, they could bleed out, right? So it's not unlike an incident response situation. Maybe you need to focus on a server and not necessarily a workstation, or the other way around, but you need to triage. You need to go through and you need to decide which of these things needs critical help and needs it first. That's the whole idea. It's cyclic in nature. We've already seen those cycles in terms of, we go through these patterns and we start with some sort of documentation and pre-planning. And ideally, we learn something in the end. We also need to think outside the box as incident responders because sometimes things are not so straightforward. A great example of that in the fire service is not just putting out fires, but sometimes rescuing people. I have a friend who's with another fire department where they also do emergency response with the ambulance. And they had a very large gentleman that they needed to get out of the 2nd or 3rd floor of a building. And they had no easy way to get him out of there. So what they did is he thought outside the box and he went to the local hardware store and he bought a whole bunch of wood and they built something to help get this gentleman out. In incident response, it's not so different. Sometimes we use tools in ways that we never thought we'd be using them just to find information out or to get something back up and running again. It's not unusual for those of us in incident response to use tools in a slightly different way. And I'm seeing more and more, and I think this is fantastic, that red team tools, folks are learning in the blue team side how to use those tools to understand where their vulnerabilities are, right? So this is an example of that. We often bring in outside entities. If you're in an organization and you have a significant breach, you might be calling in somebody like Mandiant, or your insurance company might be calling in somebody like Mandiant. In the fire service, same thing. We might not have enough manpower to handle the incident in question. So we bring in an outside agency. Maybe we need the police to help us too. Maybe we need a helicopter for some reason. All of these things involve bringing in these outside entities. And sometimes there's in-house teams. There are factories that have their own firefighting team because they know they can get to whatever it is inside a lot faster than waiting for somebody to show up. Same thing with incident response, right? Sometimes you have a team that's internal, or maybe you have 1 or 2 people that are at least your point people. So those are some significant similarities. All right, now getting to the challenges. Remember that picture that I showed you of the firefighter with the burned coat? This is a challenge. This is where I ran into tunnel vision. My focus really was changing that bottle, right? That was my job. But what I didn't notice was how badly burned his coat was. And as a result, I also didn't happen to notice that the hose on his air pack had been damaged. When I went to put the new bottle in place and snap it in and turn the air on, I actually got hit with a blast of air. And thankfully my helmet was on. And so there was, I had no injury, no damage, there was nothing. But think about what could have happened, right? I was so hyper-focused on the job and the task at hand, I didn't take a step back and look at that bigger picture. So this is an example of tunnel vision. And thankfully, it ultimately didn't lead to anything serious, but it could have. Here's another example. Same fire, different picture. Now, what you may or may not be able to see in this picture, if you look very closely, is that the cones in this image, they're protecting something. What are they protecting? Well, like I said, you probably see, maybe you can see the hose, but that's not really what they're protecting. What they're protecting is a downed power line. Now, if you come up on that scene and you are so hyper-focused on putting that fire out and running into that house, what are the odds, even with those cones there, that you might just run right into that electrical line? That's not good, right? So we have this problem in the fire service. So what was my takeaway for that in incident response? Guess what? Same thing. It's easy when there's an incident to go running in, but we should be thinking of our own safety first. And that includes both our physical safety and our mental well-being. Are you being brought in because there might have something to do with child pornography? That can be mentally very damaging. Are you walking into a server room that maybe has asbestos, like in that picture down on the right, because something's broken and you need to walk in there? We had a situation with a server room only a couple of years ago where there was flooding. Now imagine what that could have been if you didn't realize it was happening. So it's important to think about all of these things and consider the bigger picture. Before you jump to conclusions, is an incident malware, or maybe something's just misconfigured? Are you just blindly grabbing hardware to acquire it for, a forensic investigation before thinking through what that could ultimately do to the situation? If you just pull that hardware, maybe it's encrypted. And if you don't get that key, you're out of luck. Is what you're faced with really ransomware, or is it just a phishing message? It's really easy to get caught up in the moment. So here's another challenge. And you can see how one kind of leads to the other, right? This reactionary behavior, outside influences are really, really forcing you to make the wrong kinds of decisions because you're not evaluating that big picture. Instead of thinking about any kind of pre-planning or any sort of documentation you have, you're just reacting. And we do this all the time, and we do this in the fire service too. Here's an example where reactionary behavior did play a role. This was a horrible fire in Worcester, Massachusetts that involved a warehouse. That warehouse was built in 1906. It was a meat packing plant. It hadn't been in use for many, many, many years. But the fire department hadn't done any pre-planning. No one had been in it. Nobody knew what was in it. Nobody knew how it was structured. And it turned out there were mazes and mazes and mazes of meat lockers. So what happened? 2 firefighters went in because they heard there could have been somebody trapped inside. They get lost. So then what happens? Well, the chief does what he always did, sent in 2 more firefighters who subsequently got lost. And then they sent in 2 more firefighters. Bet you can guess what happened. This was a very, very sad story, and there were a lot of reasons why this went badly. But one of them was that they did not have pre-plans for this fire. And so ultimately 6 firefighters died. The fire chief, after the 6th firefighter went in, said no more. A lot of the firefighters on that scene were furious because they wanted to save their friends, but the reality is it was too late. So this happens in the fire service. It also happens in incident response, right? This is kind of what I learned. If you don't have, for example, clear goals when you're doing a forensic response, you are going to get lost in that cloud. You also can be asked for things like, find the bad stuff. Well, that puts you in a really awkward position. You're reacting because somebody says, oh no, there's a problem, find the bad stuff. Force the issue to find out what exactly are they trying to find, right? Don't just pull network connections. That's another reactionary behavior. Oh, the bad thing happened, we must pull the network connection. But I mentioned earlier, what happened if what we need to be able to do any sort of attribution or find out more about exactly what's going on, what happens if, I don't know, we need to know more? Pulling the plug might just end that whole investigation. The same thing goes for turning off machines. As I said earlier, what happens if that machine was encrypted and you just turn it off? You could have potentially pulled the key from memory, but now you're out of luck. Or you could pull information about the attacker out of memory. How about a situation where you know there's an attacker in your network, and so you just suspend all the accounts instead of, trying to figure out which account it is because, it's the end of the world or there's somebody in the network. So we do the same kinds of things, and it's not ideal. Freelancing. I make a point of defining this particular term because in our field, right, there are lots of folks who do freelancing, but they don't mean it this way. They're usually folks who are being hired in as contractors, right? And that's kind of how we think of freelancing in that universe. But in the fire universe, freelancing is not a good thing. And this is what we mean by freelancing. It's this idea that somebody kind of goes off, does their own thing, decides what they should do. They don't follow chain of command. They don't check in with anybody. And they can be downright dangerous for themselves or others. And interestingly enough, we see similar things in incident response. So here are some examples from firefighting. I thought this was appropriate. For those of you who don't know, this is from Ghostbusters, this whole idea of crossing the streams, right? So in firefighting, if we have a hose line going in the front door, we really don't want a hose line going in the back door. Because guess what happens to the poor people who are inside? Oh, I don't know, maybe looking for somebody who's hurt or fallen. Yeah, you're going to get caught between those two streams, and a lot of damage can be done both to the structure and to yourselves. So that's what I mean here by crossing the streams. There's also a problem in firefighting where you see often firefighters take out doors and windows, right? That's part of ventilation, and it's a very, very important part of our job. But it's also very important to organize that and coordinate it with other people on the scene. Because if you don't, a number of things can happen. One, you might be taking out a door or a window and causing a rush of oxygen to go into the space and causing more fire. If you take out a window in the back of the house where there's no flame and there's flame in the front of the house, fire loves oxygen. Guess where it's going? It's going right to that rear window. That's a problem. We don't want to feed that fire in the wrong way. We do want to get things open. So if you have somebody who's freelancing and doing whatever they want, they can cause more harm than good. We can see that in incident response, right? Somebody who's maybe collecting everything. They don't talk to anybody. They don't ask what's needed. So you get two people who've done collection on the same entity, same machine maybe, and now you've wasted time. Or maybe not collecting what's important. And so that stuff completely gets forgotten. I just mentioned the duplication of data collection. And what happens if you screw up and you change something because you haven't asked? Maybe there's a situation where you need to make an alteration and it needs to be documented, but nobody's doing that documentation. So there's a lot of freelancing that can go on in IR that can cause huge headaches. So here's some opportunities. Here are some good things I learned from firefighting, right? Patience. It's so easy to go running in when the bad thing is happening to try to fix the thing, because that's what we're good at, right? We're good at fixing the thing. Firefighters are good at fixing the thing too. We're good at running in and saving lives and putting wet stuff on the red stuff. But we need to take a beat. Slow is fast, as one of my fire instructors says. What you do needs to be deliberate. Consider the best course of action and consider the impact that that action will have. So back to that fire. Look at the picture on the left. Picture on the left was essentially what we saw when we pulled up. It was what I was looking at through that thermal camera. You'll notice there's flame, little tiny bit coming out in that sort of back right hand under the eaves. And you can see a little in the front and you see a lot of smoke. So we know we have a very hot fire, but we don't see a lot of flame shooting out. And with that thermal camera, I could see that the bulk of the heat and the flame were in the upstairs. That's where all of that was. Unfortunately, we weren't so good at opening up where that heat was. And so as a result, you see the picture on the right. Instead of getting up into the eaves and opening it up and getting water onto the spot where it was really hot, it burned through. So the focus was distracted, and that's not ideal, right? We want to take a beat. They were focused on getting in and just putting the flame out, not focusing on where that potential hot spot really was. So instead of, so they went in that front door, if you can kind of see the guy behind the tree, instead of getting right up underneath the eaves until there was already a whole lot of fire. We see these kinds of things in incident response as well. I bring up incident response to something called CHEG. So CHEG is a company that does a lot of things. And one of the things that it does is that it rents textbooks out to students. They had a significant breach, like something like 14 million accounts were compromised. So when somebody comes to you and says, uh-oh, OMG, WTF, BBQ, it's the end of the world, right? Take that beat. Is it an incident? And is it your incident? Think about this. So in the case of CHEG, I bring this up because this impacted a large number of educational institutions, but it impacted them indirectly. It impacted them because people love to reuse passwords, right? So if a compromised account had the same password as that of the university, is that the university's breach? No, it's the CHEG breach with password reuse. And yes, you have to deal with those accounts that are compromised, but you don't necessarily follow the same procedure as if you yourselves were compromised. So take a beat before you panic. Again, time is important, but life safety, a little more important. So don't go running into that server room just because you think there's a problem, especially if there's a situation, there could be fires or flooding or any other kind of incident where you could get hurt. And consider what that real risk and implication are of your actions and what you're going to do. Accountability. Now, accountability is knowing where everybody is. And this seems pretty straightforward. You want to make sure you know where your folks are. You don't want them tripping on things. You want duplication of effort, any sort of interference, stepping on toes, literal or figurative, because those are things that are going to get in the way of a critical incident. So in the fire service, on the left, you can see what are called accountability tags. We have these tags. This is how we keep track of who is where. We keep 2 of these on ourselves. One lives typically on a helmet and the other somewhere else on our gear. And the idea is that when you get on the truck, you put one of these on that truck. Everybody knows who came in that truck, so we all know where somebody is. So if something goes wrong and we need to find out, okay, where is everybody who came on this truck? We know exactly who those people are. If you are going into a structure like the fire that I showed you, we drop another tag with an accountability person at the door somewhere. And their job is to check to see where people are in the building. So remember the operations folks I told you about? So you could have somebody doing operations on the first floor and you could have somebody else doing operations on the second floor. But operations in general is going to know that there's a team somewhere. And so it's the person's job at the door to keep track of where those folks are. Well, in an incident response, we should be doing the same kinds of things. We might get that data through swipe card access, right? If we're in a situation where the only people who can get into a server room or enter a particular area are with a swipe card, boom, now you have some form of accountability. Frequently, if it's a bigger incident than that, and you might have other people coming in, you might want some kind of incident access log like you see on the right. So keep that in mind. If you have an incident where you need to be documenting everything that's going on, especially if you have external entities, you want some sort of accountability. I've mentioned pre-planning as part of those stages, right? You need to know your environment. I know that one of the #1 difficulties in incident response, frankly, is knowing where all your stuff is. Because if you don't know where it is and somebody says, uh-oh, then it's hard to know how many of your things have been impacted, right? That's not ideal. So we want to do some kind of pre-planning. The fire department spends a lot of time doing this with buildings, but you can be doing this with other forms of documentation and incident response. So on the left, we have form of pre-planning. I'm sure if any of you have ever stayed in a hotel, you've seen something like this. It's going to show you where you are maybe in relation to the rest of the hotel in your room. This one's a little more detailed because it has other firefighting items in it. It shows us where a hydrant is. It shows us electrical shutoffs. It shows us perhaps where other types of connections are. And on the right, you see a written pre-plan that shows us some information about how we can get into a building. There's something called a Knox box that has a key to the building, and that's how firefighters can get in, especially during off hours. It tells us something about the construction of the building. Certain types of buildings burn a lot faster and a lot easier than others. So it means we have less time in, say, a wooden structure than we do in a concrete structure. So knowing a lot more about how that building is built can help us make plans for how we're going to attack a fire. How about access? If we need to get somebody out or we need to get us in, how do we get in? How do we get out? Again, all of those things go into pre-planning. For incident response, I love bringing this up. John Strand and his team at Black Hills has come up with this fabulous card game called Backdoors and Breaches. And if you're not familiar with it, you should be. Take a minute, go to their website, and you can read all about it. It's this phenomenal card game that allows you to do some tabletop exercises. It allows you to come up with a scenario. Whoever is running the game will come up with a scenario, and then you respond to it. So the scenario is some sort of incident, maybe ransomware is hit, and it literally helps you walk through that scenario. So pre-planning in your environment is going to involve things like these tabletop exercises. Who are you going to call when certain things happen? What kind of tools do you have? What can your tools show you? Documentation about where data is. Do you know where the keys to your kingdom are? And I don't just mean accounts. Consider the fact that the most valuable data in your organization may not be where somebody else thinks it is. So you better know where it is. And ideally, you want some sort of incident response plan and a sense of who is going to handle that plan. So this is pre-planning, right? This is the exact same thing we do in the fire service. It's really valuable. If you plan ahead, then you will have a much easier time when something bad does happen. And of course, we all know it's bound to happen. So let me sum up a little here. Ideally, in incident response, we need to start thinking more like firefighters. We need to avoid that tunnel vision. So do a 360 of the problem, take a big step back, look at the big picture. What are those real risks? We want to act deliberately. We don't want to just react and being led by emotion and just doing, right? Don't freelance. Whatever plan your organization has in place, that's really what you want to be following. Have patience, as hard as it is, because let me tell you something, even in a fire, and that was the point of showing you those 2 images of the house that was on fire. If the folks at that fire who were in charge had taken a beat and thought through for that 60 seconds before they send people in, they might have had a much better save on that property. Same thing goes for incident response. Even when it seems like it's the end of the world, taking that beat is critical. Location is key. Know where your people are, know where your stuff is, document it. And pre-plans, as I said, they're amazing. Way less chaos if you're following some sort of a pre-plan, and it's going to be so much safer in so many ways. And as I mentioned earlier, consider something like the incident command system. You can Google that. There's tons of information about that out there. It's not something we tend to think a whole lot about, unless, of course, you come from the military, which uses something similar. But have your response organized. Have it thought through who's going to do what when the time comes. So some final thoughts about this. I would like to say that great things never come from comfort zones, right? So I know that there are probably some of you out there who have done EMS and firefighting and have probably been on this side of the world, and there's probably a good many of you who haven't. So stretch your wings a little, try some new things, think about things in different ways. I think that thinking about incident response in terms of firefighting has given me a whole new perspective that has, really just opened my eyes to doing things a better way. And I think that's not the only way we can make these parallels. I think Alyssa's parallels earlier for getting things right in terms of smoking a brisket are easily the same kind of things, right? So with that, I would thank you so much for coming to hear me speak. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your CircleCityCon.